Windsor.
Maybe not. I think somewhere in Florida.
What?
That's Snake Russell.
That's T.
I'll just go in there. Come here. You know what I mean? Speaker's not good yet.
Good evening, everyone, and to those joining online, we're running about 5 minutes behind today, so stay tuned. We'll get started shortly. readings. We'll start with the reading here in a minute.
One day that I show up on time.
Okay, good evening again, everyone, and welcome, Joachim. We'll get started this evening with a prayer, and then the reading in connection with Brother Joachim's words tonight. So, if you could all stand up, and we'll have an opening prayer. Almighty Father in heaven, we approach you now in prayer at the end of this day, with an opportunity to gather and have some quiet reflection around your word. We're thankful, Father, for that opportunity, able to do that in safety. And we thank you for gathering us here safely this evening. We are so thankful, Father, for this knowledge and understanding of your plan and purpose. And we know as sure as the sun rises and sets that indeed your Son will return to this earth and establish your kingdom, and we pray that we might all have a place in that glorious day to come. So, Father, open our hearts and minds tonight so that we might be receptive to the words that will be delivered, and that it might encourage us and strengthen us and continue to fill our hearts and minds with your word. So, Father, be with us this evening and accept of our praise and hear our prayer now as we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. In connection with Brother Yoakum's class tonight, he's asked that we read together Deuteronomy chapter 16. So if you'll all turn with me there. Reading from the King James Version, Deuteronomy chapter 16. Observe the month of Abib and keep the Passover unto the Lord thy God, for in the month of Abib the Lord thy God brought thee forth out of Egypt by night. Thou shalt therefore sacrifice the Passover unto the Lord thy God of the flock of the herd, in the place which the Lord shall choose to place his name there. Thou shalt eat no leavened bread with it. 7 days shalt thou eat unleavened bread therewith, even the bread of affliction. For thou camest forth out of the land of Egypt in haste, that thou mayest remember the day when thou camest forth out of the land of Egypt all the days of thy life. And there shall be no leavened bread seen with thee in all thy coast 7 days, neither shall there anything of the flesh, which thou sacrificed the first day at even, remain all night until the morning. Thou mayest not sacrifice the Passover within any of thy gates, which the Lord thy God giveth thee. But at the place which the Lord thy God shall choose to place his name in, there thou shalt sacrifice the Passover at even, and the going down of the sun at the season that thou camest forth out of Egypt. And thou shalt roast and eat it in the place which the Lord thy God shall choose. And thou shalt turn in the morning and go unto thy tents. 6 days shalt thou eat unleavened bread, and on the 7th day shall be a solemn assembly. 7 days shalt thou number unto thee, begin to number the 7 weeks from such time as thou beginnest to put the sickle to the corn. And thou shalt keep the feast of the weeks unto the Lord thy God with a tribute of a freewill offering of thine hand, which thou shalt give unto the Lord thy God, according to the Lord thy God hath blessed thee. And thou shalt rejoice before the Lord thy God, thou and thy son, and thy daughter, and thy manservant, and thy maidservant, and the Levite that is within thy gates, and the stranger, and the fatherless, and the widow that are among you, in the place which the Lord thy God hath chosen to place his name there. And thou shalt remember that thou wast a bondman in Egypt, and thou shalt observe and do these statutes. Thou shalt observe the feast of the tabernacles 7 days. After that thou hast gathered in thy corn and thy wine, and thou shalt rejoice in thy feast, thou and thy son and thy daughter and thy manservant and thy maidservant and the Levite, the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow that are within thy gates. 7 days shalt thou keep a solemn feast unto the Lord thy God in the place which the Lord shall choose. Because the Lord thy God shall bless thee in all thine increase and in all the works of thine hands. Therefore thou shalt surely rejoice. 3 times in a year shall all thy males appear before the Lord thy God in the place which he shall choose, in the feast of unleavened bread, and in the feast of weeks, and in the feast of tabernacles, and they shall not appear before the Lord empty. Every man shall give as he is able, according to the blessing of the Lord thy God, which he hath given thee. Judges and officers shalt thou make thee in all thy gates, which the Lord thy God giveth thee, throughout thy tribes, and they shall judge the people with just judgment. Thou shalt not wrest judgment, thou shalt not respect persons, neither take a gift, for a gift doth blind the eyes of the wise, and pervert the words of the righteous. That which is altogether just shalt thou follow, that thou mayest live, and inherit the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. Thou shalt not plant thee a grove of any trees near unto the altar of the Lord thy God, which thou shalt make thee. Neither shalt thou set thee up any image which the Lord thy God hateth. So I'll turn it over now to Brother Yoakum in his class entitled, Serve the Lord Thy God, your Lord, your God, with joy and gladness.
Thanks, Josh. Good evening, everyone. Sorry we're a bit late. Perhaps you had a bit of snow on the way coming in as well. We did too, and it slowed us down a little bit, that and dinner. So I'm a little bit conflicted because I realized, I'm doing this series on Deuteronomy, because I just find Deuteronomy a really fascinating book, and I've learned a lot about God. I've learned a lot about His purpose. I've learned how to live in a more helpful way, there's just like Deuteronomy is just such a fascinating book. And so I gave the first class last fall sometime, and then I just gave the second part in the series this past Sunday evening, and now I'm at the third of the series, which is all about joy. And then I realized that I have already given that here as an exhortation. But I also have no grandeur illusions that anyone remembers my classes. So does anyone remember an exhortation on the theme of joy? No? It's a joy to listen to, thank you. All right, and we'll do it again. Yeah, hopefully. So what we looked at in the first class on Deuteronomy is that, we looked at what the purpose was of Deuteronomy, right? Because it's just seemingly, it's just like a collection of a pile of laws and like a little bit of repetition of what they had gone through, right? So they refused to enter into the land, and then God said, okay, you're not going to go in, and you're going to wander in the wilderness for 40 years until all of you are dead. And they're like, oh, no, we'll go up now, and it didn't go well. And then, God gives them the 10 commandments, and then just a whole bunch more commandments. And then Moses gives some final farewells, and then Moses dies. But what's the purpose of Deuteronomy? Because the children of Israel would have gone into the promised land if they had just said, yes, we can conquer these giants, it's not an issue, we're going to go in. Then Deuteronomy never would have been given. And so there's a purpose behind Deuteronomy. And so then in the first class, we kind of looked at what are some phrases that are repeated over and over and over in the book of Deuteronomy. And so one that we saw was, when you go into the land, when you go into the land, when you go into the land. So it was all about, preparing them to go into the land. And then another one that was repeated over and over was, where they're going to go into the land. And what was the specific point where they're going to enter into the land? This is a question for audience participation. What was the point where they're going to enter the land? So, yes. So Jordan River specifically, yes. It's when you cross the Jordan to enter and to possess the land. When you cross the Jordan, when you go over the Jordan. So there's a lot of focus on them crossing the Jordan. Now, Jesus lived in Galilee, but he also went all the way to the Jordan because that's where John the Baptist was baptizing, right? So there's a strong connection between, the Jordan and baptism, right? And I think that was the main, and the other thing that was repeated over and over was, do this that it may go well with you. When you go into the land, you inherit the land, that it might go well with you, that might go well with you. And so and then the last class we looked at, or the second one, was that really God was describing himself, and Moses was describing God as a father. And it's really important, I think, to understand that Deuteronomy was given by a father. And if you're a parent, and I think most of us have had parents at some point in our life, you understand the relationship of a parent and a child, and that is who God is. And that's really important to realize, that he isn't, this distant, all-powerful deity who just, says, this is my command, and if you don't do it, I'll punish you. And there is elements of that, but it's not just, obey my law or else. Like, that's not what a father does. Right? A father, or a parent, you want it to go well with your children, which means that you're going to withhold things from your children. It means that you're going to discipline your children. It means that, you perhaps let them learn lessons, the hard way, that you won't shelter them from something because they need to learn it, I'm not going to name any examples because my kids are right there and I'm not going to give away my secrets. But that's what a father does. That's what a parent does, right? And so the book of Deuteronomy, as my kind of takeaway, was given by a loving father to prepare his children for baptism so they might live a life faithful to God, surrounded by people who are not faithful to God, that it might go well with them. Now, that completely relates to our life, right? Because God wants us to do the same. He is preparing us to the point where we want to be baptized. We want to lay down the old man and live for him. He wants us to inherit that land. He wants it to go well with us, right? And so when we look at the book of Deuteronomy, we have to look at it in that way. Okay, this is, what does God want me to learn from this? How is this God showing me love? And then, you look at commandments like, the Sabbath. You look at a Sabbath day and you realize that, it's best for me to get rest from time to time. It's best for me to slow down, right? And that's why God scheduled Sabbath days every single week. There's a day where he just rested, but he also had, like back-to-back Sabbath days or even a whole week. And so God regularly, like at least 3 that I can think of, was like a whole week off. So the Jews had this time off, the time to just slow down, to relax, because otherwise if you don't, you're just going to be filled with stress and that sense of busyness that no one really enjoys, and yet so many of us live like that, right? And that's why, you realize that, okay, this is the way God wants us to live because it's best for us. And all of Deuteronomy really, I think, is like that. And so I'm, trying to go through Deuteronomy and understand what's the purpose behind this. Well, some of these laws I'm not going to obey, like I'm not going to sacrifice in the temple. But what is there to learn from this? And so one of those is, another example that I brought up on Sunday was, no Moabites or Ammonites will ever enter into the congregation of God. And then Ruth the Moabitess is called to come in, right? And so why would God even give that commandment knowing that he was going to bring Ruth in? And so there's clearly something to learn there. There's something to understand about God and about his plan and his purpose. Trying to raise us up, trying to guide us through life. And we, maybe not all of us, but most of us are just at that teenage generation where we think we know better and we think we know it all and we can talk back to our parents because we're smarter than they are. I am in that. Well, maybe I'm starting to grow out of it. I realize how little I know. But that's kind of my approach to Deuteronomy now that I've kind of explored that a little bit. And so that brought us into Deuteronomy 16. And I left off with a question on Sunday evening. If you're able to listen to that, I left off with a question. And I know I've said this before, but you can, maybe you've heard it said, or maybe you've said it to your child. Like if I say, hey, Jorah, can you do this? And they're like, no, I don't want to do that. And then the reaction is like, listen, you're going to do it and you're going to like it. But it doesn't work, right? You can't make someone like it or like anything. Like you can make someone do something if you really want to force them to do it, but you can't like make them like it. Like that's your feeling, that's your emotion. You can't do that physically. There's no way for you to do that. But that's exactly what God does, right? And that's what we read a few times actually in Deuteronomy 16. If you're still there, and I'll go there as well. You can see how he says that a few times. So Deuteronomy 16, and just for an example in verse 9, you shall count 7 weeks for yourselves. You shall begin to count 7 weeks from the time you begin to put the sickle to the standing grain, and then you shall celebrate the Feast of Weeks to the Lord your God with a tribute of a freewill offering of your hand. which ye shall give just as the Lord your God blesses you. And you shall rejoice before the Lord your God, right? You shall rejoice before the Lord your God, you and your son and your daughter and your male and your female servants, and the Levite who is in your town, and the stranger and the orphan and the widow who are in your midst, and in the place where the Lord your God chooses to establish his name. You shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and you shall be careful to observe these statutes. You shall celebrate the Feast of Booths 7 days after you've gathered in from your threshing floor and your wine vat. You shall rejoice in your feast, you and your son and your daughter and your male and female servants and the Levite and the stranger and the orphan and the widow who are in your towns. 7 days you shall celebrate the feast of the Lord, right? So there's a whole week, a whole week of holidays, basically. 7 days you shall celebrate the feast of the Lord your God in the place which the Lord chooses, because the Lord your God will bless you in all your produce and all the work of your hands, so that you will be altogether joyful. And that is a command. You will do that. You will be joyful. And the really interesting thing is, if you go over to Deuteronomy chapter 28, you can see that God has actually set some pretty severe consequences for not being joyful. Let me just take a quick peek here. So in verse 15, look at the beginning of the chapter. It says, "Now it shall be if you," so this is verse 1 of Deuteronomy 28, "if you diligently obey the Lord your God, being careful to do all his commandments which I command you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations of the earth. All the blessings will come upon you and overtake you if you obey the Lord your God," right? And then it says, "Blessed you shall be in the city, and blessed you shall be in this situation. Blessed will come upon them." But then in verse 15, there's the consequences of disobedience, as it is. The heading is in my Bible. Verse 15, "But it shall come about, if you do not obey the Lord your God to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes, which I charge you today, that all these curses will come upon you and overtake you." And then it lists all these curses. Now, if you go over to verse 47, right, so they have the commandments that they need to serve the Lord their God with joy and gladness. And then in verse 47 it says, "Because you did not serve the Lord your God with joy and a glad heart, for the abundance of all things, therefore you shall serve your enemies, whom the Lord will send against you, in hunger and thirst and nakedness and in lack of all things. And he'll put an iron yoke on your neck until he has destroyed you." Now, if you look back at the history of the Jews, that's happened to them a number of times. And so God says here that is a consequence of you not serving God with joy and gladness of heart, like he commanded them to do. So why does he command them to be joyful, and why are the consequences so severe? Right? If you think about what happened to the Jews, even in the Second World War, for instance, that's very, very severe. So why then? What is there to learn? What can we learn about this commandment to be joyful? So, questions asked, and what does it mean? What does joy mean? Right? What is joy? What does it mean to be joyful? And you can maybe think of other words, like if you're gonna look for synonyms, it's going to be like glad and merry and happy, those kind of words, right? But let's turn to James chapter 1, and we'll actually see that there's something quite interesting, which it's kind of a random word here, and until you look up the original Greek word here, the whole meaning of this verse actually really changes. So James chapter 1 and verse 2, so I read the NASB, and it says, "Consider it all joy." What are some of your translations have there instead of the word consider? Count it all joy? Anything else? Anything different than count? No? Okay. So consider or count, right? That's the way that word is translated, and that kind of makes sense, right? "Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. Now, that's really hard to do. If you're in a situation where you're really sad about a loss, or you're really angry about something, you can't just flip the switch and say, well, I'm just going to consider it joy. It doesn't work like that. And if you try to do that, but just say, like, no, everything is fine, then you're just burying the road, right? So what does that mean? So that word consider or count is translated, this is a really fascinating thing. It's translated in two different groups of ways. So it's either like count or think of or esteem or consider. The other group of words that is used to translate is like governor or leading. Those are really two kind of different words, but I'll show you some examples of how that's translated. So right close to Hebrews. So if you go to Hebrews 11 and verse 11, actually, that's the way, it just shows that this is the way that is translated in other places. So verse 11 of Hebrews 11, by faith even Sarah herself received the ability to conceive, even beyond the proper time of life. She considered him faithful who had promised, right? And so she thought of God as being faithful who had promised, right? So that's a way that's used again in verse 26 as an example. Said they're considering the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, right? So you're thinking of something in a particular way. Now, the other way that it's used is an example is in Acts chapter 7. So in Acts 7, you'll see that it's translated in a very different way. So Acts chapter 7 and verse 10. We can just start in verse 9, maybe. The patriarchs became jealous of Joseph and sold him into Egypt. Yet God was with him and rescued him from all his afflictions and granted him favor and wisdom in the sight of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and made him governor over Egypt and all his household. And that word governor is the same as the word count or consider. And there's another one, which I don't have written down, but be able to find it fairly quickly. This is in chapter 15, Acts 15. And in verse 22, this is the Jerusalem conference. They're kind of wondering what to do with the circumcision and the law in general. And then they kind of come up with this letter that they're going to send. And that seems good to everyone in verse 22 of Acts chapter 15. And says, then it seemed good to the apostles and the elders with the whole church to choose men from among them to send to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas, Judas called Barsabbas and Silas, leading men among the brethren. That word leading is the same as the word governor in Acts 7, but it's also the same word that's used in James chapter 1, verse 2. Right? And so you've got, on the one hand, it's to think of, and on the other hand, it's to lead or to govern. And so I talked to a brother who actually knows and understands Greek, which I don't. But the takeaway there is that when you're angry about something, when you're grieving, when you're mourning, when you're just really any emotions, what he is saying here, James, is that you want your leading consideration to be joy. So that means that you have to work through things. You can't just flick a switch, right? It's a process. But ultimately, I often say that when you go through a traumatic experience like losing a spouse, those kind of things, or losing a loved one, they will say, don't make any major decisions within a year, because often those decisions are based on your emotions, the new state of life that you're in, and they say, take a year to just absorb the new reality of your life and then start to make some major decisions, right? And I think that's what James is saying, that, ultimately, what's going to lead your next step should be joy. And that's a decision, and that's not a feeling. Like love, isn't really a feeling. I mean, it's nice if you feel like loving someone. That's kind of an in-love feeling. But love it should always be a decision, and you can have that discussion, is it possible to love someone that you don't like? Well, it is. Because you might not always get along with someone, but you will choose to love them because you have to, and God tells you to, and you have no choice. But that's not easy. That is something that requires effort and work, and you have to be really intentional about that. I think that's something that we need to understand about joy, is that when God says that, it's not a feeling, it's not an emotion, it is a decision. And so that means that whatever happens in your life, you can always decide that you will be glad and thankful for what God has done. And you will have that joy lead your next steps. Although, if you just turn to Philippians, you can obviously do things to make it easier for people to decide joy, right? So, for instance, I know, Levi, you enjoy this chapter as well, or the whole book. There's lots of joy in here. Philippians chapter 2 and verse 1, he says, "Therefore, if there's any encouragement in Christ, if there's any consolation of love, if there's any fellowship of the Spirit, if any affliction and compassion, make my joy complete by being of the same mind, maintaining the same love, united in spirit, intent on one purpose," right? So Paul says, make my joy complete. And so even though it is your own personal decision to feel joy, or to be joyful, to be glad, that is your own frame of mind, your own state of mind. It's your own decision. By your actions, you can make it a lot easier or a lot harder for other people to choose joy. Right? If you're constantly bring tension and arguing and whatever you're bringing to a relationship, it's so hard to feel joyful. Right? But if you are bringing peace, and if you're bringing calm, and you're bringing happiness, and you're bringing love to a relationship, then it's a lot easier to decide joy. Right? Let's turn to Proverbs chapter 17, because there's I found a really interesting verse as well. Proverbs 17 and verse 22. So he says there in verse 22, Proverbs 17, "A joyful heart," this is the NASB, "a joyful heart is good medicine, but a broken spirit dries up the bones." Does anyone have a different translation for that? A joyful heart is good medicine. Dave?
A merry heart does good like a medicine, but a broken spirit drieth the bones.
Okay, yeah. So it does good like a medicine, yeah. Yeah, so kind of similar to NASB. Yeah, it's a good medicine. Josiah, nothing different in the ESV? It's pretty similar.
First verse is the same, second verse is, "But a crushed spirit dries up the bones."
Yeah. So the word medicine is misleading, right? Because medicine is a foreign substance, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with medicine. But it's important to realize that medicine is something that you take in. So what actually this says in Young's Literal translates this very differently. It says there, "A rejoicing heart doth good to the body, and a smitten spirit drieth the bone," right? So a rejoicing heart doth good to the body. So the rejoicing heart itself provides that healing. It's not a foreign substance, because it isn't something from the outside that makes you choose joy. It is you. It's not a feeling. It's your decision. Right? So a rejoicing heart, if your heart is in a state of joy, if you're choosing joy and you're choosing gladness, it actually is really, really good for you. And it does heal. And that sometimes, we can think of those things and be like, wow, that's all feeling happy and whatever can never heal your body. But the reality is that God has designed all of your bodies to heal itself. That's true. Because what happens if you cut yourself? God has created your blood to, I don't know what the word is in English actually, coagulate? Sure. And then it goes kind of hard, and it stops the bleeding, right? And if you break your bone, all you have to do is just kind of like set it in its original place, and the bone will grow again, and then your bone will heal. God has designed your body to self-heal and self-regulate, as some professions would say. And what the proverb is, what God is saying in a proverb is that when you have a joyful heart, it will heal you. And they've actually proven that what happens is if you release all the kind of the happy hormones, like endorphins, and what are some other happy hormones? Endorphins, serotonin, dopamine, there's one more. Oh well, whatever. All those happy hormones. What they actually do is they will speed up the process of the blood cells that will are just the chemicals in your body that need to move around to go to the place where their healing needs to happen. That goes faster, more efficiently when those other chemicals are in your body, the dopamine and endorphins and those kind of things. Right? And so they've shown that is it's a more effective way of healing, of your body healing itself. And it's true, laughter is a good medicine. I think that's a saying. Like if you're in a state of misery, it's going to be a lot harder to heal than if you're really optimistic and joyful and you can see that there's a way out of this, right? There's actually another verse that uses that same concept. It's in Hosea. If you want to try to find it. It's in Hosea 5 and verse 13. And it says there, when Ephraim saw his sickness and Judah his wound, then Ephraim went to Assyria and sent to King Jareb, but he is unable to heal you or to cure you of your wound. And that word cure is that same as that word medicine that was used in Proverbs, all right? So it actually isn't medicine, it's just cure, it's healing. So that's really interesting to know that is what joy, being in a state of joy, does to you. And so the takeaway again is that we have a God who created us, and he knows best how we function. And so he knows that life is going to be, he says constantly, that it might go well with you, that it might go well with you. He wants it to be well with you. Right? That's what he wants. He wants things to go well in your life, like a loving parent. And one way for it to go well in your life is for you to be joyful. And that's why he says, you are going to take this time and you're going to rejoice. You're going to consider everything that I've done for you. You consider all the goodness that you have in your life. And you'll choose joy. And he's just teaching us that as children, that hopefully we'll grow up and realize that, okay, yeah, you know what? Like hopefully all of us learn, to not stuff your face with whatever food you want. It's best to just, have things in moderation. And then hopefully we learn that as adults. That's basically what God is doing. He's a loving Father who wants things to go well with us. So if you just turn back to Deuteronomy 16, you can see that God, made this a rule, a law in their lives, to regularly take time to reflect on all the good things that God had done for them and they have in their life. And everyone in their family had to participate in this, right? Even the strangers and the widows and wouldn't have really had their own land, and so they wouldn't really been able to grow any produce. And so God says, you're going to invite the Levites to join you in this celebration. We already read the first few verses there, but in verse 16, we haven't read those, I don't think. It says, 3 times in a year, all your meals shall appear before the Lord your God in a place which he chooses. At the feast of unleavened bread, at the feast of weeks, at the feast of booths, they shall not appear before the Lord empty-handed. Every man shall give as he is able, according to the blessing of the Lord your God, which he has given you, right? And I think that's really important to know as well. So, he makes this a regular occurrence throughout their yearly calendar. And he basically tells them, like, you're going to set aside some of your produce, some of your income, whatever, to do this. And you may say, well, that's really easy if you make a ton of money, but I don't make a ton of money. So, how can I do that? Life is hard. I'm barely scraping by. But God is saying, give as you're able to, right? You have to live within your means, but you're still able to get something that you can rejoice with, right? But that's why God said, include everyone in your circle, include everyone, your neighbors and those that are near you, those that are in your family, and maybe your servants, literally have nothing. But then you allow them to rejoice with you, allow them to celebrate with you, right? We go back to chapter 14, and I know that I've talked about this before, but I just thought this was super eye-opening. It's not an excuse to do whatever you like, but it is really eye-opening. So Deuteronomy chapter 14 and verse 22, and it says there, so this is the law of tithing that comes in here, right? So that's, they're supposed to set apart a tenth of all that they made. So verse 22, you shall surely tithe all the produce from what you sow, which comes out of the field every year, right? And that comes up again in Deuteronomy 16. You shall eat in the presence of the Lord your God at the place where he chooses to establish his name, the tithe of your grain, your new wine, your oil, and the firstborn of your herd and your flock, so that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always. Now get this, in verse 24, if the distance is so great for you that you're not able to bring the tithe, since the place where the Lord your God chooses to set his name is too far away from you, and the Lord your God blesses you, then you shall exchange it for money, and bind the money in your hand and go to the place which the Lord your God chooses. All right, so basically saying, like, if you can't carry all that stuff, then sell it and then take 10% of that, right? I mean, that probably goes for most of us. A lot of us don't get paid in goods anymore. A lot of us would just get money. And so then he says here in verse 26, you may spend the money on whatever your heart desires, for oxen, for sheep, for wine, or strong drink. Like, that just seems so counterintuitive. That God is encouraging people to buy strong drink. And it's not an excuse for us to go crazy, but I think what God is saying is that, you need to enjoy life. You actually need to plan in your life to regularly be joyful and celebrate. And if that includes some wine, then that's perfectly fine. But you need to schedule that into your life, because if you're not going to do that, it is really hard for you to be joyful. Right? If you're not going to take the time to stop and think everything that God has done for you, then it's really easy to just get into that rut where you think, well, if only I had this, if only my job, if only my children, if only my spouse, if only my parents, if only. That it's really easy to get in that attitude. And then instead of remembering all the good things that your children or your spouse or your parents or your friends or whatever your job has done for you, then nothing's ever good enough. Nothing will ever make you happy. Right? And so we have to actively be very intentional about making joy a regular part of your life. Make celebrating a regular part of your life. That's what God commands his children to do. And so we actually haven't done this in a little while, but I know I've definitely said these things before, so sorry for repeating myself. But it was one thing that our family did for the longest time, although it's been a couple of years, was we would call that a fancy dinner party, where we'd all get dressed up. We wouldn't go anywhere. We'd stay at home, and everyone would say what their favorite food was, and then we'd go pick it up. So then you're left with a dinner of sushi, French fries, pizza, I don't know what else, olives. Loves our olives, bottle of wine, and and then when we bring out our best dishes and our nice wine glasses, and I think Tony and Deb gave us a set of wine glasses for our wedding. And they're like nice, I don't think they're actually real crystal, but they're kind of like that crystal looking. And they came with like these little like tiny wine glasses, but they were just like almost like little shot glasses, but they're the same kind of like crystal looking glass. And I clearly remember like one of my kids like had it in his hand and like set it down, and the whole top just flew off. So that was the end of that little glass. But I read a book once, or maybe I listened to a CD by a lady. Her name is Barbara Coloroso, and she said, like, what's better if your kids, when you die and your kids have to clean out your house, what's better if they, have to, clean up, like all these missing, these sets of dishware, and no set is complete, and they're all chipped and whatever, and have amazing memories with your family, than all your fine china sitting perfectly still in the cupboard with no rejoicing at the dinner. We should do that again. I also journal. I have a book that a friend of mine gave. It's a 5-year journal. So every page is for a different day of the year. So January 1st, January 2nd, January 3rd, or whatever. And it has 5 entries. And so every year I can go back and I see what I wrote the previous years. And it's kind of cool. And I decided, like this would be like my gratitude journal, and I try to write things that I'm grateful for. And it's kind of nice because, if I'm having a kind of a crummy time, I can recall those memories that you otherwise are never going to remember. And I write stuff that the kids said that made me laugh, or whatever, something that happened that I was really grateful for. And sometimes, I have to be honest and say I'm thankful for, this person that made me angry, because it taught me that I need to work on my patience, But yeah, regularly reflecting on that. And also another thing that I've also mentioned before, but I'll say it again, is I refuse to watch any kind of news. And I heard a quote today, I was listening to a podcast this morning. They're 2 American Christians, and they said, this one lady also never watches the news, and she said, I'm not going to have people who do not serve God, people who do not know Jesus, I'm not going to have them come into my house and tell me what I should be afraid of, and tell me what I should worry about. Like, why do I have people who know nothing about God, filling my brain with all these things that are just going to give you anxiety and anger, and and social media does the same thing. It just gives you more and more things that you supposedly should be really riled up about, or angry about, or whatever you should go do something about, even though it's happening in Thailand, you're never going to go. Right? So you can choose to remove those things out of your life that actually do not bring any joy, that just bring anxiety and anger, or whatever they bring into your life, right? So I think that is that's what the lesson is of joy in Deuteronomy. And I'm gonna glance at my watch here. Let's look at one more verse. I think this is really important in Hebrews 12. Hebrews 12, verse 1 to 3. And when I said last verse, I totally meant second last. So Hebrews 12 and verse 1, and it says there, because this is really important. This is another reason why God makes us do this, right? Why does God make us rejoice? This is why. Verse 1, chapter 12, Hebrews. Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who, for the joy in the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of God, right? And so we can look forward to this joy, and that helps us through the difficult times, right? So joy does help us through those difficult times, to the point where he was able to give up his life and still pray for forgiveness for the people that were hurting him, right? And so even when you feel you have very little in your life to rejoice about, there is always the future to rejoice about. And then this will actually be my really last verse. And when I say verse, I mean chapter. Isaiah 35. It's just an amazing chapter. And, one thing that you could do if you wanted to was like highlight anything in this chapter that is related to joy, as like joy or rejoicing or gladness, anything related to joy. So we'll finish off with Isaiah 35 because it is only 10 verses. And I'm pretty sure Matt's grandfather wrote a hymn, "A Rose Shall Bloom," and it's in our hymn book. Matt Ward, I think his grandfather wrote that. It's kind of cool. So chapter 35 and verse 1, it says, "The wilderness and the desert will be glad." And so this is totally the future, your future. "The Arabah," the desert, "will rejoice and blossom like the crocus. It will blossom profusely and rejoice with rejoicing and a shout of joy," right? This is your future. It's a future full of joy, rejoicing. "The glory of Lebanon will be given to it, the majesty of Carmel and Sharon. They will see the glory of the Lord, the majesty of our God. Encourage the exhausted and strengthen the feeble," right? That's what it's supposed to do. "Say to those with an anxious heart, take courage, fear not. Behold, your God will come with vengeance. The recompense of God will come, but he will save you. Then the eyes of the blind will be opened, and the ears of the deaf will be unstopped, and the lame will leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute will shout for joy. For waters will break forth in the wilderness, and streams in the Arabah. The scorched land will become a pool, and the thirsty ground springs of water. In the haunt of jackals, its resting place, grass becomes reeds and rushes. A highway will be there, a roadway, and it will be called the highway of holiness. The unclean will not travel on it, but it will be for him who walks that way. And fools will not wander on it. No lion will be there, nor will any vicious beast go upon it. These will not be found there, but the redeemed will walk there, and the ransomed of the Lord will return, and come with what? With joyful shouting to Zion, with everlasting joy upon their heads. They will find gladness and joy, and sorrow and sighing will flee away. So, brothers and sisters, even if life doesn't feel joyful, even if life is stressful, and you feel you don't have anything to rejoice about, I'd say look for it. But if not, the future is coming. This is the reality of your life if you want it to be. And so the lesson from Deuteronomy, from a loving Father who wants us to live a life faithful to him, surrounded by people who are not faithful to him, that it might go well with us. And a part of that is to choose joy.
Thanks, Joachim. Appreciate that reminder, especially during long and dark winter. So, some good reflections there. It's interesting, your premise at the beginning was that Deuteronomy was a book written, obviously, for the children of Israel. It didn't need to be, had they have followed and done the right thing from the beginning, but it was a father to his children, trying to prepare them and guide them and lead them towards a better life. And of course, it was all prompted from their murmuring and complaining and not choosing joy in all that God had done and delivered them from, which of course we read about in Deuteronomy 16. So that was the contrast, right? You can murmur and complain, or you can realize all the great things I've done for you as your father. Choose joy and you'll have a good life. Okay, so we'll close this evening in prayer through our brother Lee. If you could all please stand.
In approaching you, O Great One, I often refer to you as our Father, and was expressed by our brother this evening in recognizing the words of Deuteronomy chapter 6. You are our Father and take care of us in ways we do not appreciate. But we are looking at you as one who has given us the ability to be emotional, to be joyful. And joy often comes from sharing, being around other people. It's not something that's isolated. like the other emotions of depression or despair. And you have surrounded us with a great cloud of witnesses to share with, to grow with, to learn thy will and thy ways, and to look forward to thy Son's return to this earth and setting up thy kingdom. We look forward to this day. We thank you for the efforts this evening through this brother's words. We also thank you for the food at this time. Through Jesus we do pray. Amen.